that is a good example of what I mean of how they come in different shapes and sizes. And
Yes.
what you always have to look at is how is that behavior making them look good or
Okay.
keeping them up on the ego pedestal.
Right.
So if he's a people pleaser, then people love them. Like,
Yes.
oh, he's
Yes.
so nice. He'll do everything
He'll
for
do
me.
everything for
It's
me. Yeah.
not because he has empathy and he wants to make
Right.
people feel good. He wants to make people feel good because then they think of him as a
Of
nice
him is
person and
great.
it feeds his
Yes.
ego.
Yes.
And that's what's so confusing.
Welcome to the That's Where I'm At podcast. I'm Laura, happily divorced after spending years with a narcissist. I believe keeping secrets will make you sick and that they always come to light in the end. As women, we're often told to be quiet, don't share your story, don't talk about the things we go through. It's making women sick, sad, and suicidal. We don't have to be on the other side to share our story. This show is for the women still in the middle of the mess, but showing up bravely as they heal. It's time to share these stories with each other so we can learn, grow, and heal together. I'm Laura, and that's where I'm at. Please take note that this episode may contain subjects that may be triggering to certain listeners. Please take care when listening today.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to the That's Where I'm At podcast. Today I have Chelli. Chelli is a licensed professional counselor, a level 2 certified clinical trauma professional, and an author with 30 years of clinical experience. She is the author of Insight is 2020, How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. And she's also a survivor. She specializes in working with complex trauma, adult attachment, and narcissistic abuse recovery. So welcome, Chelli.
Thank you, Laura. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. You're going to really tell us all the stuff, aren't you?
We'll see.
That's right. Gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, I kind of told you where we were going to start, and I feel like I'm going off somewhere else already because this is where I feel like I want to go.
Okay.
Narcissism is such a buzzword right now, right? Okay, so tell me what your opinion is. Do you feel like, because I was in special education for a long time, and people would say, like, oh, I feel like this is more of a buzzword right now. I'm like, are we more diagnosing or are we just being more aware? So what's your opinion, you
Yeah.
think?
Well, my opinion is, and this is without hard facts behind it,
Yeah.
that I think we're just more aware.
Yeah.
I think it is very underdiagnosed. And part of the reason it's underdiagnosed in the mental health world is because narcissists in particular
Yeah.
usually don't self-identify as
No.
narcissists and they don't think anything's wrong with them, so they don't
Yes.
seek out help. And
Yeah.
I mean, I do know, I will just say a really quick little stat here on it. In the DSM-5, which is the holy grail of
Yes.
diagnostic categories for mental health professionals,
Okay.
they estimate that 1% of the United States population is diagnosable or with narcissistic personality disorder,
Okay.
only 1%. And then 16% of the clinical population, so those are people that make it into the mental health system.
Okay.
And then when we look at Google or social media,
Yeah.
it's like all over the place.
Right.
I think that maybe someday we'll find, more numbers, but we live in a world where everybody's on social media and the internet all the
Yeah.
time. And if you ever look up something like that, then your world is all kinds of people coming up with, this is narcissistic
So
abuse,
every
right?
single every single thing is that's my
Right.
algorithm. That's totally my
Yeah.
algorithm. But
Yeah.
I mean, I intentionally do that because I do like to share the information, but I'm like,
Yeah.
I feel very understood because for a long time I was like, is my husband just a jerk? Now I can read back on my journals and go, oh no, he's a narcissist because
Yes.
there is a pattern, right? And so that's why I tell people who say, like, okay, because it's an oxymoron to me, a diagnosed narcissist, because I think I think one of the things you should be able to check the box is they're not going anywhere near a therapist to get diagnosed with anything. Check. You know what I mean? That's one of the first check boxes, right? Because all
Exactly.
my ex, all he did was manipulate the therapists that we were with to make me look like I
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
needed to go on meds and all these things. But when certain people maybe that are struggling with a difficult spouse or something or parent, and they say, well, he's not going to get diagnosed or anything, I go, you don't need a diagnosis. If you think there's an
No.
issue, you just need strategies. That's it. You know what I mean? Like, so I wanted to have that discussion because I do tell people, I'm like, it doesn't matter if he's diagnosed. I know he's textbook. I have strategies on how to live
Hmm.
my life healing now. I don't have to interact with him, but healing, right? So,
Right.
the cognitive dissonance. And it's like, why is your brain feeling the way it is? And knowing that there's nothing wrong with you. There was something going on, right?
Right.
Okay, so we informed
Yeah.
everybody with that.
Well, and I do want to just add something.
Yeah.
Like, I love what you said, that you don't have to diagnose it. And the other thing that's important to know is that narcissism really exists on a spectrum, and we all have a little bit of
Yes.
narcissistic traits in us.
Yes.
And it's just that some people have higher traits and then fall over into the category of, if we were to look at them as a therapist or a
Right.
doctor, that we could diagnose them in that way. So
Yes.
what I tell people is kind of along the lines of what you said, that what's more important is, if you suspect that something's going on or this
Yeah.
relationship feels horrible, the angle that I take is, we need to look at the symptoms that you're experiencing
Right.
in your relationship. And there are very specific trauma symptoms that are indicative
Right.
of you being in a relationship with a narcissist, a psychopath, or a sociopath. And
Right.
that is what we focus on, instead of worrying about
Yes.
diagnosing your partner or your ex.
Yes, I love that. Because it's true. That's what we want to focus on. And I believe, and I could be wrong, I'm just doing this from being in therapy, not being a therapist. It just helps you with the healing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
my healing from a narcissist is going to look different than I was if I was healing from a different trauma or whatever, right?
Right.
It's going to.
Absolutely.
And so that's what I try to encourage people to understand. I talk about this because if you're experiencing this, there's targeted ways to heal. It's really helped me to understand that, because I felt terrible and I felt dumb that I let it happen and all these
Mm-hmm.
things, right? But these are all normal feelings. And that was
Right.
helpful. That was helpful to me. So tell me how you got into doing this line of work. It says you're a survivor, so
Yeah. Maybe
join the club,
unintentional. Right.
right?
Um, well, let's just, I think, first of all, I've been a therapist for about 30 years. And so really my entire career has been in the mental health field. And prior to that, I grew up in a home where I did have some adverse experiences, especially from the time that I was 10 and older.
Okay.
And one of those experiences, or one of the things, was that my stepdad was a narcissist.
Okay.
And I witnessed some domestic violence between my mom and my stepdad, and grew up in a home, at least from that point on in my life.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know what a narcissist was at,
Right.
10, 15 years old, but I knew that something was horribly wrong. And, like many people in the mental health world, I call us the wounded healers. You know, I'm drawn to social work, counseling, psychology,
Yeah.
and become a therapist, even in my own journey of trying to figure out myself.
Right.
And so, I think, coming from a home where I was wounded, had trauma, and was involved, I was doing therapy from the time I was a teenager, and I loved it. Like, I sought out my own therapy as a teenager, and it was interesting and inspiring to me and really helped me. And so that also helped me get through, my whole adult life of trying lots of different therapies, personal growth, spiritual
Okay.
growth, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But in particular, what I realized is, I don't get specific with who the narcissists were in my life, other
Right.
than my stepdad, but I will, just to protect
Yeah.
identities.
Of
But
course. Yeah.
I spent most of my adult relationships with narcissists or narcissistic people.
Okay.
And as a therapist who worked with domestic violence from the very beginning of my career,
Mhm.
and I kept thinking like this was just an unhealthy relationship. These are
Right.
toxic partners.
Right.
It wasn't until there was one relationship in particular that I had after I've been divorced twice, I will say, after my second or my first marriage. And this person was the most scary and like, walking textbook example of a
Okay.
narcissist and probably a sociopath. And it destroyed me. And that was where I really got into this. Like, I have to understand how I got sucked into this relationship. Like, how did I
Right.
not see this? And why
Right.
was it so hard to leave?
Mhm.
And why was it so hard to heal? And I developed
Right.
really intense cognitive dissonance, which I heard you mention, but that's, where you're like, you have these conflicting thoughts
Right.
about your partner. Is he good? Is he bad? Is he my soulmate? Is he my abuser?
Yeah.
Should I go? And that cognitive dissonance becomes really debilitating for a survivor. And it is a
Yeah.
big thing that keeps you stuck. The
Yes.
problem is, at least back then, and very much so even today, we didn't even understand. Like,
Right.
then that was in the 2000s when that happened to me. Nobody had even done the research yet until
Okay.
Sandra Brown, who is my mentor. She wrote Women Who Love Psychopaths, and she's really one of the primary researchers in this field of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse. And she had this idea of cognitive dissonance being this hallmark trauma symptom of survivors from these relationships. So
Yeah, I
I
have to
want to kind of
say, I
pull
don't
that
wanna cut
in.
you off, but I have to say that to me was one of the worst things for me. Not I mean, I'm like, I do not like this person in any way, shape, or form,
Right.
don't wanna go back, anything, but my brain is like, "Why aren't we married anymore?" You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Why aren't we with this
Ex-
person anymore? And I'd be like, "Brain, stop it," because
right.
it did not make sense. That to me caused a lot of shame.
Yeah.
And it's why, like you said, it keeps us stuck, right? Keeps us stuck and it
Yeah.
keeps us wanting to go back. Not that what that was an option for me, but even wanting to go back to someone who was terrible to us. And
Exactly.
it's so hard. But
It is.
that's why it's so important to understand what happens, because then we
Hmm.
can say this is normal and we have to fight
Right.
it, right? I mean, it just
Exactly.
that's why I think it's important to talk to a therapist or do other kinds of holistic therapy as well, because and I've done lots of things, because this was the most confusing thing for me. I didn't understand.
Hmm.
I'm like, why am I crying about this guy when he was in my abuser? Why am I crying about him? It didn't make sense to
Right.
me, you know. But when you spend
Yeah.
so many years with somebody, it's confusing. Your
Yeah.
your
It
brain is
is.
trained, right? Your brain gets trained.
Well, it's their Jekyll and Hyde
Yes.
personality shifts, and then they love bomb you. They're
Yes.
being really kind, or they're
Yes.
making apologies for what they did,
Yeah.
and then they're abusing you. And when you have that back and forth all the
Yeah.
time, it is a trauma because
Hmm.
you see this very distinct change,
Yeah.
and it is abusive,
Right.
all these tactics that they do. And that is what develops the cognitive dissonance, is that Jekyll and Hyde type of personality.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's so much more of the
I
trauma,
know.
that goes on. And you mentioned shame. And,
Yeah.
I will say cognitive dissonance first develops in like questioning their behavior, or who is this person? Is
Okay.
he good or bad?
Yes.
Is she an abuser? Is she my soulmate? Like,
Yeah.
and then you question the relationship. Is this healthy or unhealthy,
Right.
loving or abusive? And
Right.
then the third kind of layer of cognitive dissonance is when you develop it about yourself. And most
Okay.
survivors are kind. They have personality traits usually of being very agreeable, flexible, forgiving people, very conscientious. And then they start to question, like, how am I allowed? Like for me, I'm like, I watched my mom go through this.
Right. Right.
I'm a feminist. I don't believe that we should, like I was looking at all the gender issues in our
Right.
society. And as a therapist, I'm like, this is not okay. I go to work every day and help
Yeah.
women get away from this. And why am I in
Right.
this relationship where this guy is abusing me? And I keep
Right.
going back, and I felt tremendous shame and
Yeah.
confusion about what was going on with
Yeah.
me. And I couldn't find a therapist. Like, I was working with a therapist,
Okay.
and it worsened it because most therapists don't understand this specific form of trauma
Okay.
and, how it becomes so complicated. And so
Right.
I was feeling worse about myself in it. And,
Yeah.
I finally left that person, but then went on throughout, more of my adult life. And in
Right.
retrospect, realized I kept finding partners that were narcissists. I'm like,
Yes.
nothing, no one was as bad as this one
Right.
until my later, another long term relationship where I thought I had done all the work. I thought I had figured it out. I thought that I was,
Yeah.
looking for all the red flags. And then I fell in love with somebody else. And he was a very different kind of narcissist. He was a covert narcissist. He
Yes.
seemed very generous and kind and even grandiose ones. Like sometimes you can see
Yes.
it easily, but even, because they have so much charm and charisma,
Yes.
sometimes you may not recognize it, but it can be easier. But the covert narcissist, I mean, it threw me for a loop. And when I started to see the signs
Okay.
of something that was wrong, and I kept thinking, I kept trying to diagnose it in my head because I'm a therapist. And
Right.
I was like, I got to make sense of this. And I thought,
Yeah.
well, does he have trauma? Does he have multiple? It seemed like I
Yeah.
was even thinking multiple personalities because
Yeah.
the distinct switch from one to the other. And I could literally see a
Yeah.
shift in his facial expression, his eyes.
Isn't it
And,
scary? I want to
it's
talk about that.
terrifying.
It isn't it strange? Okay, look, a covert. So the covert is, I don't know the definition, the real definition, but right, it's the it's the ones where they have a facade on the outside. They're the nice guy and all that, right? It's that kind of thing on the outside. And I remember he would like have a smirk on his face when he was being mean to me, and
Hmm.
his eyes sometimes would be black, and I'm
Yes.
like, and this is true. When I started reading about that, I'm like, oh
Yes.
my gosh, I remember this. It was terrifying. I'd go,
Yes.
why are you like smirking right now? I'm like crying from the
Hmm.
things he was saying to me and the way he was treating me, and he would be smirking. I don't get that.
Yes.
Like it's psychotic. It was
It
scary.
is.
It
Yeah.
was scary.
It's terrifying. And that is very a common theme that I hear from all survivors,
Yeah.
and, at the end of the day, whether they're covert or grandiose, most narcissists have that, they have a facade and it will look different ways. And I always say, like, narcissists come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. Like,
Yeah.
don't get too hung up on grandiose or covert. I mean,
Right.
it's important to know those two things or to, I mean, I can go into a little bit more about what that looks like, but essentially, like, don't think that they all look like this big, grand, like,
Yes,
I'm
exactly.
so
Yes.
amazing, everybody worship me kind of person.
Yes.
It could be your pastor at your church. It
Mhm.
could be the yoga instructor who
Yes.
is all spiritual. And it could be the guy that goes, like you said, gives out meals to the homeless. Like,
Yes.
or they could just be a horrible person who is,
Yeah.
obviously mistreating people. Like,
I just
it's
thought of
very
I just thought of
scary.
a person for everybody everybody you described. I just thought of,
Yeah.
which is really
Yeah.
sad and really scary.
Yeah, and I often hear people, like, that's some of the cognitive dissonance that can get created too, where,
Yes.
people will say, "Well, he was doing all this to me, but he's
Yeah.
this philanthropist, or,
Yeah.
he treats everybody else so nice." And I'm like, "Yeah,
I
that's what
know.
they do." And
Right.
me and my kids knew what this
Mhm.
person would do, but
Right.
nobody else saw it. And that is part of
Yeah.
the gaslighting and the cognitive dissonance that gets
Yes.
developed of, like, am I nuts? Like,
Right.
why me?
I
So,
I remembered what I was going to ask you. The thing
yeah,
was about, I know that this disorder doesn't mean that they're diagnosed with this disorder, but this disorder is rooted in shame, right? And it comes from emotional neglect. Like their
not
bottom,
always.
not always. Okay.
Well, the jury is still out on the
Okay.
causes of these personality disorders.
Okay.
There's some evidence to suggest that there is a genetic
Oh,
component.
okay.
So sometimes it could be that you've got a parent, they get the gene, they become it.
Okay.
There can also be, it can be from some, we'll say the environment. It's kind of this nature versus nurture debate.
Yeah.
So it can definitely be that maybe there was a narcissistic parent who
Yes.
raised this child to
Yes.
be their golden child and to be entitled and to have all the, narcissistic qualities. Sometimes kids just grow up in an environment with, neglect or abuse, and that also can create some
Yeah.
developmental issues that can lead to narcissism. So there's different factors that could be
Okay.
involved, but there are definitely some indicators that there could be a genetic component as well.
I
But
just felt
the
like
shame can be a piece of it for
yeah,
sure.
yeah, because I often said in therapy that felt like he was a people pleaser, but always wanted it his way. And
Hmm.
and now it makes sense because he's a narcissist, now that I've understood that. But in therapy, they would say, like, that doesn't make sense. I go, well, I don't know how to make it make sense. That's how he is. He's a people pleaser. On the outside, he's trying to make everybody happy, but he wants it his way at home. And I guess that was the
Right.
the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of thing, where you just don't understand. That's why I would try to explain it to them. They're like, that doesn't make sense. I know that mine was created with emotional neglect. My ex-husband,
Yeah.
because he has a mother who has trauma and it was passed down. And that's
Hmm.
why I'm so adamant about, like, can we all go to therapy and go deal with our trauma,
Yeah.
please? So that
Right.
we don't pass
Right.
this stuff on to our kids.
Well, I want to piggyback on what you said
Yeah.
about nobody got it. He was a people pleaser to everyone else.
Yes.
And that is a good example of what I mean of how they come in different shapes and sizes. And
Yes.
what you always have to look at is how is that behavior making them look good or
Okay.
keeping them up on the ego pedestal.
Right.
So if he's a people pleaser, then people love them. Like,
Yes.
oh, he's
Yes.
so nice, he'll do everything
He'll
for
do
me.
everything for
It's
me. Yeah.
not because he has empathy and he wants to make people feel good. He wants to make people feel good because then they think of him as a
Of
nice
him is
person and
great.
it feeds his
Yes.
ego.
Yes.
And that's what's so confusing. So
Right.
you always have to kind of like dig a little deeper and understand how it is feeding their ego essentially. And the shame comes when somehow they get knocked off the pedestal that they've put
Yes.
themselves on, whether you disagree with them or
Right.
somehow in their
Or
distorted thinking,
someone else
they
doesn't like them, or someone else doesn't appreciate what they did for them.
exactly.
Are you feeling trapped in a relationship that leaves you questioning your worth and sanity? Have you noticed the red flags and decided you can't live one more day in a toxic environment? Whether you've just left or are considering leaving a narcissistic partner, the book, Married to a Nice Guy, Getting Over Narcissistic Abuse, is here to guide and support you. In this candid memoir, I share my 33-year struggle in a marriage to a nice guy that was marked by emotional manipulation and abuse, revealing how I broke free and reclaimed my life. If you've been waiting for a sign, this book is it. If you've ever felt isolated, confused, or hopeless in your relationship, Married to a Nice Guy, Getting Over Narcissistic Abuse offers the understanding and guidance you need to break free and start your journey to healing. You are not alone, and you deserve a life filled with love, respect, and happiness. Order your copy today and take the first step towards reclaiming your life. I wanted to talk about, because I know this is something that we talked about before, was kind of patterns. Because one of my friends, and I don't remember which episode it was, but one of my friends talked about how she didn't know anything about narcissism or anything, but she started keeping track in her journal of patterns. And
Yes.
I think if I would have kept track that way, I would have maybe noticed, oh, he's only people pleasing outside of the house, not inside the house. And inside the
Yes.
house, he's being really difficult and it has to be his way or the highway.
Yes.
What do you think about that with patterns and keeping track of patterns,
Yes.
stuff like that?
I highly recommend that you either journal or keep lists. And so journaling, the important thing about that is there you can then have a history because
Okay.
of cognitive dissonance, we have a tendency to remember the positive events and forget about the negative things,
Oh,
or
okay.
you forget about how long you've been seeing all this.
Yes.
And so then you can go back and read your journal and be like, the same thing
Yeah.
for 10 years. I've been writing the same thing. This is not going to change.
That's me.
But one thing that we say about journaling is sometimes just free journaling can
Okay.
be triggering for the trauma that you have.
Okay.
And so if you're finding that, like let's say your therapist says, go home and journal about it, but yet it's making you feel worse.
Yes.
Something to do instead is just to list, like you could list the patterns or list, okay,
Okay.
he made me do this today, but don't do the free
Yes.
association kind of journaling
Okay.
if it
Yes.
makes you feel worse. So that's just one little trauma
That's
thing
great.
that we try to help survivors with.
That's great. That's a really good thing to do to help protect yourself if you're feeling like it's triggering like that. Just making
Right.
a list. I know I did make a shit list because because the cognitive dissonance was driving me bananas,
Yeah.
and I had to say because my brain was like, remember all the good times. I'm like, brain, we got to remember the bad times too. So I had to make a list. I mean, things I already knew, but something to look at to remind myself, he did this, he did that, and I did it in list form, like you said. I didn't have to free write or whatever. I just
Mm-hmm.
wanted to have a list to help me break that cycle of only thinking about the positive
Yeah.
because my brain was trying to always think back positively. I'm like, he's already with somebody else. We have no choice. Deal with it.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
it's really hard. So, the patterns, okay, with you having, I don't know, okay, you're scaring me with, you were trying to because, because I haven't ventured out to date. I think I'm just gonna become a nun. Well,
Yep.
because I know I'm still working on myself because
Yeah.
Laura has a pattern. You know what I mean? Like I totally get it. I think back to everybody. And of course, I was very young when I started dating my ex-husband. So I've only been with boys before that. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I didn't even have a fully functioning brain when I married my ex, and that's the hard part. But now, what are things we can look at to try and break these patterns? Maybe
Yeah.
we need to put down, maybe we need to make lists about our own patterns, about what we do and who we
Well,
choose and who we're
it's an
choosing.
excellent question because there are some things, and I talk about this in my book.
Okay.
And the way that I kind of break this down is that we need to be aware of external red flags and internal red flags. External red flags
Okay.
are learning about all the things to look for as red flags
Yeah.
that could be indicative of a narcissist or a psychopath. And, you can go Google all that. If we had 3 more hours, we could go
Right.
into it, but we
Exactly.
don't. So those are the things you want to look for. But because they're very charming,
Yes.
superficial, like have a lot of charisma, you can miss those things. The more
Yes.
important thing is internal red flags. And
Okay.
so this is where we have to know a lot about ourselves and what makes us vulnerable. And so some research that my colleague Sandra Brown has done
Uh-huh.
is to find that women survivors tend to have two personality traits in particular that make them vulnerable.
Okay.
One is agreeableness. It's a personality trait that makes you very forgiving.
Yes.
You're flexible and easygoing. You have a lot of empathy and compassion.
I
You will
feel
overlook,
personally attacked. Okay, Chelli, I feel personally
right?
attacked right
Hey,
now.
me too, girl. Me too. I'm agreeable to a
Yes.
fault. So, but that's the thing. Like,
Yeah.
it's the trait that gets you into these relationships because, oh, they did something bad. It's okay. I'm going to give you another chance. Or, oh, it's
Yes.
your childhood trauma. I understand.
Right.
And so you will overlook a lot of things and be super easygoing and forgiving because you're a nice person. Now,
Okay.
being agreeable is a great trait to have in the world, but it can make you highly vulnerable to people like this. They target people like
Yes.
agreeable people like us.
Right.
The other trait is conscientiousness. And
Okay.
this is the trait that we like to say will keep you in the relationship once you're hooked.
Okay.
Conscientious people tend to have a lot of high values and integrity. So They might believe like,
Okay.
I don't just give up easily on a relationship, or maybe you're
Yes.
married and you don't want to break your wedding vows.
Yes.
Tend to be more type A, organized, disciplined people. And
How
so
how
it's
did
like,
I do
I'm
both?
going to work on this. I'm gonna work on this relationship until I'm dead, you know?
Yeah, that was
Uh,
me too. Okay.
yep.
Wow, I'm getting called out on all
Yeah.
my garbage today. No, but I am very
It's not
well
garbage. They're
I
beautiful
know.
traits.
Well, they are, and I'm very well aware of them, and I just know I will use my powers for good, not evil, you know what I mean? Like, that's what I've
Yeah.
decided, and I did work on codependency, and so where does that factor in? Because I feel like both of those traits are very I was very codependent, wanted to make sure everybody was happy and blah, 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 and, that being agreeable thing is a little codependent, it can
Well,
be.
so with codependency, I have a problem with that word
Okay,
because, well, I mean, it's my own thing, my little nitpicky thing. But codependency, I like to look at as like an umbrella, kind
okay,
of broad term to describe a lot, to describe what we think of as codependent behaviors.
okay,
But underneath it, there are a lot of things that make somebody act codependent. And if we don't understand what the roots are, we're not going to fix the codependent behaviors.
okay.
And I also think there's a lot of judgment around being codependent, having codependency.
Yeah.
So agreeable people can have codependent behaviors because of what we just talked about.
Mhm.
Another thing that can make you vulnerable to these relationships or can look like codependency is having an anxious attachment style.
Okay.
And that's a whole other
Yes.
discussion. If people are
Yes.
familiar with attachment, you know what I'm talking about. If you
Yeah.
don't, go look up anxious attachment.
Right.
And people with anxious attachment are very focused on relationships. They need a lot of reassurance and
Okay.
connection, and they fear abandonment. And when a narcissist, for example, comes in and love bombs them with, I want to talk to you all day long. We're the
Yes.
best. We're going to move in together. I
Yes.
love you. That is like heaven for somebody with an anxious
Right.
attachment. It's
Yes.
taking care of all their fears of abandonment and I'm not good enough. And
Right.
then here comes the abuse,
Yes.
triggers the anxious attachment, keeps them stuck. And that looks like codependency. I'm giving a
Okay.
very
No,
bird's
but
eye level
no,
view
but
here.
thank you for explaining that. That makes a lot of sense. That it's, and fortunately or unfortunately, all this stuff is kind of jumbled together, right? I mean, one's
Mm-hmm.
doing the other, and it's kind of like a big mess. The whole thing's a big hot mess anyway. So,
It is.
no, that was a really good explanation. That was really good. I haven't looked
Mm-hmm.
into attachment styles very much, but I have been seeing that around, and I'm interested in. I will go look it up because, and I might, if I feel motivated, I will put this stuff in the show notes. I'll put
Yeah. Well,
some of the things we talked about. I'll put some of these descriptions or definitions, is what I was trying to say. Why do you think we repeat some of these things? Why do we miss it? And could it be some of the things we've been talking about? Our attachment styles. Maybe we didn't work on ourselves enough. And what does that even mean? Like, it's not like you get a graduation certificate. Do you know what I mean? Like, why are we missing some of these things?
well, some of it is this field around narcissistic and psychopathic abuse.
Yeah.
This is the research is in its infancy.
Yeah.
And even though there's a ton of research and work on domestic violence, intimate partner violence, not all domestic violence is caused by somebody who's a narcissist or
Right.
psychopath. There can be other reasons.
Right.
This is an offshoot that falls under that umbrella of intimate partner
Yes.
violence. And it's working with people with personality disorders in particular and the damage they cause in their relationship. So that part, like the association that I am part of, it's the
Mhm.
Association for MPD, Psychopathy and Survivor Treatment Research and Education.
Okay.
And we are trying very hard to educate therapists and the
Yes.
public about this
Thank God.
because therapists miss it, first of
Yeah.
all, and actually can make things worse,
Yeah.
especially if you're in couples therapy and you're with a narcissist. If you ever, by the way, if you ever think that your partner is a narcissist, do not go to
Yeah.
couples therapy for any reason ever. I don't care if you were working with John Gottman or Dan
Oh my gosh,
Tatkin, the
we tried.
gurus of therapy, don't do it.
We tried. I love John Gottman and all his stuff and everything, and we watched the videos and everything. But
Uh-huh.
the last, and I talk about this in my first episode, the last therapy we went to, I think it was up until like June or July, and we got divorced. We started divorce proceedings in August. So it was that. I was like, this is it. This is the last. And I should, thinking back, I'm like, my gosh, I was still trying after 32 years with this guy,
Yep.
trying to get him to explain, trying to get him to understand, and the therapist did not understand narcissism. I didn't
Nope.
really fully understand it myself at the time. I kind of was suspecting he was gaslighting me, but I didn't even know what that meant,
Mm-hmm.
really. And she said he was very handsome. And what was I complaining about?
I have no words.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you're hearing dead air because our mouths are wide open. Yes, that's what I was told.
That probably is at the top of my list of horrible things therapists say to people in these situations. I mean,
So disgusting. So disgusting. And he was just sitting there with this smile on his face, like he was
yep,
the greatest husband.
charming.
And he's so charming. And I'm like, yeah, I
Yep.
could insert lots of things here, but I was like, you've got to be kidding me.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would get mad that I didn't bring up, because I had an issue with other women in our marriage. And he said, well, you never bring it up in therapy. It's like that's that's part of the manipulation, right? That
Yep.
you don't have to just bring it up in therapy. I can just bring it up at our kitchen table if I want to.
Exactly.
I don't need a professional. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but
It's okay.
but it's scary to want to, you want to go to therapy, but I'm so thankful that you're trying to educate other people, because I hope that even if if somebody went to couples therapy, if the therapist is educated, she could, she or he could say, oh, okay, I think I'm dealing with a narcissist. It's,
Yeah. And there are plenty of therapists that will do that, or maybe they're afraid to say to, some
yes,
therapists are trained that you don't meet alone with a couple, like you always meet with them as a couple. Some
okay,
are afraid to tell people, like, oh, I think your partner's the narcissist, you should run.
oh,
And
okay,
my background was in marriage and family therapy, and so I've definitely been on the other end of it, and that's part of why I stopped doing couples therapy a long time ago, because I work
yeah,
a lot with this.
yeah,
But the problem is that you can have examples like yours, which is really extreme,
yeah,
but a lot of times the narcissist comes in looking really charming, and they
yeah,
will charm and fake things,
yeah.
and the therapist falls for it unknowingly.
No.
And then here the survivor is completely traumatized, falling apart, emotionally dysregulated,
Yeah,
getting angry about things that's like, I a term I like to say is dog whistling. Like in
right.
a couples therapy,
Yes,
the narcissist uses a dog whistle term,
yes,
like something that only the survivor knows he's abusing
right.
her with or is threatening her with, but
Yes,
it's benign to the therapist.
yes,
And then you're freaking out, and the therapist's like, I don't see the problem. I had a
yes,
therapist. I told her,
yeah,
and just to make you feel better, I was with somebody, said, I do believe he's a narcissist, but I was still in cognitive dissonance and wanted to work on it.
okay,
And I told her point blank he was, and she said, I don't see it. And it
yeah,
was so painful and invalidating for
yes,
me,
yes,
and really threw me for a loop. It, like, I felt so gaslit because I was so sure finally at
yes.
that point, and then she said that, and I had to second guess everything again.
Right, because you don't have that's the thing is when you're in cognitive dissonance. I don't know if I'm using the in it, you know what I mean? I don't know if that's the
Yep.
right terminology, but
Yep.
when you're in it like that, you do start to question yourself, because I felt so gaslit in our last marriage counseling, so gaslit. The person who
Yes.
saved me, and why I believe you shouldn't see the same therapist for individual counseling as marriage counseling. I think they should
Yes.
be
Never.
different. The
Yeah.
person who saved me was my individual counselor, who I still see to this day. And I told her, I said, you kept saying to me, you've made yourself really clear on what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Is he
Mm-hmm.
unwilling or is he unable? And we don't even have to go into all that. Is your partner unwilling or unable? Not, they don't understand, because they do. They pretend like they don't understand what you're talking about. They have no idea. The therapist just said you're handsome. So, that I'm handsome. So I guess there's nothing to worry about. And then, that they both ganged up on me, and I did throw a fit. I think there was dog whistling, which I will put the definition in the in the show notes. We're not going to define it right now, but there was dog whistling because I ended up, they wanted to put me on meds and all this stuff. I threw an entire toddler fit. And when I told my individual therapist, she said, "Oh no, you're good." And I think she didn't want to say like, "They're doing this to you," kind of thing, but she kind of guided me. She knew I was wanting to leave, so she was guiding me in a way without, trying to tell me what to do. She didn't say like run, but
Right.
but I was like, "I threw a toddler fit and this is what happened." And she's like, "Yeah, it's none of her business. You don't need to go on meds. You're okay. You're allowed to," I don't even know if she said dysregulated, but you're allowed to be off for a moment
Yeah,
and be upset. You're allowed to without having to go on meds.
absolutely.
Yeah. And
And
that,
especially when you're being abused,
yeah,
oh,
exactly. I know it's so hard, but okay. Well, I hope that we gave people lots of information. to, to,
one of those
no
conversations we
one,
could do for hours and hours.
oh, I'm telling you,
And we
look,
barely scrapped or
no, we
scratched the
barely
surface
did.
this morning.
Okay, so let's summarize somewhere.
Yeah.
I think it's important to work on ourselves. I know that's been important for me, working on my value, because when I did not find value in myself, I did allow him to kind of run the show, tell me what I liked and didn't like and all those things, and I just said, "Okay." And now I actually have opinions and things like that. So, what are some of the things that you think people can take away from this for working on themselves and, some other things like that?
Well, what I'm going to say, and we didn't really get into
Mm,
this, but what's really important to know is that if you are with a partner like this,
yes.
you are likely experiencing trauma. And just quickly, research
Yeah.
says that 50 to 75% of women who come out of one of these relationships have symptoms of trauma, or
Okay.
90% have symptoms of trauma. 50 to 75% have enough symptoms that they could be diagnosed with PTSD.
Okay.
The problem is that there is a very unique presentation of PTSD in
Yes.
survivors,
Yes.
that most therapists have. It looks very different than typical
Well,
PTSD.
and we can totally
So,
talk about that. We don't have to wrap it up anytime soon, but we can totally talk about this because I know that the thing I've seen with this kind of PTSD is complex PTSD, right?
yeah, yes.
That's the term I'm throwing around. I
Well,
really don't even know much about it. I know because we think of PTSD as somebody coming home from war or something. And so, tell me a little bit about that. What does that look like?
well, with PTSD for survivors, it has a very different presentation than most therapists are trained to look
Okay.
for. The hallmark symptom is cognitive dissonance, and we've
Okay.
already discussed what that looks
Yes.
like.
Yes.
Some other things, though, are so one typical example of regular PTSD is you might block out or have a hard time remembering negative things or the traumatic events, or
Okay.
you might actively avoid being reminded of them.
Okay.
But with survivors, they will have some of that. But what happens is they hold a lot of positive events, or they think about the positive things like that usually occur during love bombing or
Yes.
apologizing or whatever, and get highly tuned into those. And
Okay.
so looking at either one of those can be trauma, whereas regular PTSD, we're only looking for, oh, they're just thinking about the bad negative
Okay.
event. That can be really confusing. And then the same goes for nightmares. So PTSD, you can have nightmares of the event.
Yes.
Survivors can have nightmares of the abuse, but they can also have very disturbing positive dreams
Yes.
or sexual dreams or whatever of
Yes.
your partner, and
Yes.
that messes with your mind too. So it's
Yes.
the positive and the negative, which is indicative. It's the cognitive dissonance
Okay.
kind of thing.
Okay.
So
Okay,
those are
well, that's really helpful to understand. And so Are you feeling like this is not widely known yet?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So that's why this has been so important to me to get this information out, because look, I'm getting a lot of information from the internet. I'm not going to therapy school or anything, but I am in therapy, and I just have had to learn. I'm like, why am I feeling like this? And so I had to go figure out why am I and thankfully there is information out there saying that this is the way my brain is working, and these are the things that are happening. So I'm so glad that we're able to talk about that. And then, it's hard because the recovery, I think people want a time frame, right? Like, I was in this terrible relationship, and now in 2.7 weeks you will be feeling better, and it's everybody's recovery time different.
It is. And this is why it's important to recognize this as trauma and to work with a therapist who, right now, there is a training that's out there that's
Okay.
teaching therapists about how to work with this, but it is in its infancy.
Okay.
So at the ideally, it's somebody who's done our training. Secondary, somebody who is a trauma therapist,
Yes.
trauma trained and experienced therapist. And that's a whole other discussion.
Right.
Some people say they're trauma informed and they actually don't have any idea of how to work with trauma. So it's important to kind of understand what that means. But a trauma therapist who at least has experience working with narcissistic abuse and domestic violence would be the next best step. A trauma therapist, and then doing some reading. And my book, some of Sandra Brown's work. I have an online group that I have, and I'm not trying to sell this to people.
And you are more than welcome to, because I want people to reach out to you if they feel like they want to work with you and get more information. So, and we'll provide all this information in the show notes so that people can connect with you. No, go ahead and tell me. You have a group, and what do you do?
Well, I have it's an online group for women survivors, and it can be used as an adjunct to your therapy or a complement to your therapy, especially if you're working with a therapist who doesn't have training in this. So it covers all of the trauma aspects of it, and it is not a substitute for trauma therapy.
Yes.
It is an educational program to help you with that. So, and it can be for somebody who's already done therapy. They want to understand this, or they're getting their feet wet. So that's a good place to look. The other thing is, the thing to not do is to go start dating when you're in the middle of a separation and divorce, or you just got out and you haven't done any trauma work. Please don't do that, because I can pretty much guarantee you're probably highly likely to end up with another predator, narcissist, or psychopath. Not always, but that is not a good way to take care of yourself.
Right.
There is no specific timeline. It is about taking time to heal and to not rush into the arms of another partner thinking that is what's going to help you.
Right.
But trauma doesn't go away on its own typically. It does take the help of a trauma therapist or trauma work. Sometimes there's and that is not a coach. I'm going to there's a lot of lovely survivors who are coaches that have their place in doing this work and advocating and educating, but that is not trauma therapy. I just need people to understand that you could have both, but don't just go to a coach and think you're getting trauma therapy, because coaches are not trained to be trauma therapists. So,
and that's the thing that's been important.
My 2 cents.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that's been important to me is I've been doing lots of different things. You know what I mean? Not just one or whatever, because I just feel like there's so many parts of our body and all these things, there's so many different things, movement and, journaling and holistic coaching and real and therapy and these kinds of things, that are just so important to that we are really healing all the broken parts of us. The thing is that it is a trauma to go through this thing. And so it's not going to just be, okay, well, let's go on a date. It just doesn't sound like something that doesn't sound like.
But it does happen. It does happen a lot. And I do want to clarify the thing about coaches, because I really honor the work that survivors are doing. And it has a place in the world. And sometimes that is the first place that a survivor gets validation, that connects the
Right.
dots. Like
Right.
I'm feeling teary just thinking about the
Yeah.
advocacy and women coming together and supporting each other.
Right.
But
Yes.
so let it be a stepping stone. Let it be a
Yes.
piece that gets you some validation or support. But don't forget that this is trauma, and you must work on healing trauma with trauma therapy.
Okay.
However, wherever you get it, and if anyone listening wants to
Mhm.
know more about that, I am always like happy
Yes.
to answer emails or help people get pointed in the right direction.
Yes. Oh, no, for sure. Well, where can everybody find you?
Well, my website is the best place.
Okay.
I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, but I know you'll have that in the notes
Yes.
because my
Yes.
name is ChelliPumphrey.com and it's spelled weird, so you're going to have a hard time looking that up.
Well, we will put it in the show notes. Everybody will have everything clickable so they can find you, because it sounds like you have a lot of good resources, your book and everything that you have. So a lot of good resources. Thank you for doing this work and taking care of all of us. And I know we didn't touch on everything we could have. I mean, I'm telling you, we just
Okay, this is
didn't.
great.
No, so thank you so much for being here. And guys, if anything resonated with you today, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and of course on social media, and reach out to Chelli if that's something that you would like to work with her on. So Chelli, I appreciate you so much for being here. Thank you so
And
much.
Laura, I appreciate you and for you sharing your story and doing this work. Like we have to do this together, all of us. So thank
Yeah.
you for the opportunity.
You're so welcome. All right, guys, we'll talk to you next time. See you then.
Thank you for joining me today on the That's Where I'm At podcast. Did the story today resonate with you? Do you think others would benefit from hearing the stories we are telling? Please go to Apple or Spotify right now to leave a review so everyone in podcast land will know you love the show. We want to continue sharing stories of hope and healing. I'll be back next time. I'll talk to you then.